Hi, I'm Jake Overgaard, University of Minnesota Extension educator, and I'm here today to talk to you about produce safety as farm safety. I'm going to start a little bit by kind of explaining the issue and why food safety is a part or can be considered a part of farm safety, and then talk about some different ways that we can reduce the risks of contamination of produce and causing illness of people who eat that produce. So let's get started. So I think of food safety as a part of farm safety because when we're handling and managing uh, fresh fruit and vegetables on the farm, there are ways that we can do that has potential to make people ill. Well, think of who all eats the produce off your farm, whether it's a garden or if you're working on a commercial farm that sells fruits and vegetables. It's not just you. It may be people beyond just your family. It may be people in your extended family, maybe neighbors or visitors. Some people are bringing fresh fruits and vegetables to food shelves in their communities. And then again, if you're working on a commercial scale, we need to be thinking about your customers. And there are ways that we can do things poorly and cause people to get sick from eating our fruits and vegetables. These days, a lot more people are eating a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables, which is healthy and a good thing to do. Um, but since they're eaten raw and they don't go through a kill step, which would be involved in cooking, it does carry a little bit more of a risk in having people get infected with pathogens that are on that produce. We can eat lots and lots of fruits and vegetables very safely, but we need to do things probably a little bit differently and more carefully than if we're just growing things that are going to get cooked. Um, I'm not talking about things like field corn or soybeans. I'm talking about fresh fruits and vegetables like tomatoes, lettuce, apples, berries, and especially those things that don't get cooked. I like to share just some examples of outbreaks that have happened in the United States, just so that you have an idea of what can happen. And this is probably not going to be at the scale that you're working if it's just your garden, obviously. But it could be if you're working on a commercial farm. Um, but either way, it's just to give you an example of what can happen when something goes wrong. Um, so the first example has to do with spinach, and it was in 2006 where there was a really, really big E. coli outbreak, and it caused nearly 200 people to get sick, and 3 people actually died, and it was traced back to a contamination from cattle. Um, Something a little bit more recent from 2011, where we had cantaloupe that was carrying listeria, which is a bacteria. And in that case, we actually had 33 deaths, and just over 104 people got ill from that outbreak. More recently, like in 2018, we had a number of outbreaks related to romaine lettuce. Um, so again, these are just examples of the illnesses that can happen and the fact that we could actually cause people to die because of carelessness or poor food safety practices. Here are just some symptoms of foodborne illnesses, and what you can see here is there's a large variety of them. Um, Things like diarrhea, fever, chills, headaches, loss of appetite can all be caused by a foodborne illness. And kind of the point here is that um, we might experience these things, and they could actually be a food related illness. But the likelihood of us actually figuring that out may be low because, if I just have um, some of these symptoms, I'm probably not going to go to the hospital, and it's probably not going to really get reported or understood as a foodborne illness. Um, so we may have reports of a number of people getting ill, but it's probably much lower than really is in real life. All right, this graph shows the types of produce that have been associated with outbreaks from the years 1996 to 2014. So you can see that our leafy greens and sprouts are our most common offenders, but also that there's a really wide variety of different fruits and vegetables that have been linked to illness and outbreaks with produce. The other thing that I want you to be thinking about in terms of risk of illness is that we're not just talking about you maybe consuming food out of the garden or food off your farm, but those high risk populations that are more likely to become ill because of a foodborne illness. So the very young have underdeveloped immune systems and have a greater chance of becoming ill. Very old people have decreased immune function and again can get ill more easily. People who are immunocompromised, so their immune system is compromised, they may have AIDS, they may be going through chemotherapy, they may have had a transplant, things like that. Also, pregnant women tend to have a little bit more higher risk of getting ill as well. So we need to be thinking about these high risk populations when we're considering food safety. Some of the microorganisms of concern, I've been talking about different pathogens and contamination. These are the ones that we're most concerned about, and they're typically passed through feces. So they get spread through feces, whether it gets contaminated on our hands and it gets on the vegetables, or it's in manure and gets on the field and onto some lettuce or whatever it is. So bacteria is a big one. That can be things like Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria is another example. Virus includes things like norovirus or hepatitis A. It's another example. And then within parasites would be something like Giardia. So these are kind of our three main groups of microorganisms that we're worried about. Adding to the challenge of keeping our produce safe is some of the biological hazards that are out there. And what I mean by that is some of the surfaces of produce make it much more likely to become contaminated and carry pathogens. So think about the surfaces of these three items. So we've got some lettuce, cantaloupe, and strawberry. The lettuce has a lot of surface area and kind of some areas where things can get stuck and are more or less protected. So feces or manure or whatever it is can land on it and have some protection. So strawberries and cantaloupe have rough surfaces, which allow things to also get stuck on their surface and are hard to get off, which make things more difficult as well. So these are just some of the challenges, and we need to think about produce like this and take a little bit more extra care in their production to avoid contamination. Here are some of the sources of contamination that we ought to be considering. So ourselves, either through or hand washing practices or dirty clothes, whatever it is, we can contaminate produce. Our soil can carry things, whether it's through feces or manure application. Water can become contaminated. Our buildings, our tools, and then animals, whether it's livestock or wild animals as well, are things that can contaminate stuff. So let's get into ways that we can reduce that risk. And I'm going to talk a little bit about wildlife, manure and soil amendments, livestock, water, and then hygiene. So let's start with wildlife. Wild animals really present a challenge because there are a lot out there and some of them really like our produce. So we're talking about things like deer, rabbits, mice, and other birds. Just an example of where a wild animal has contaminated produce and made people sick was in Oregon in 2011, where we had deer feces contaminated strawberries and ended up with 15 people sick and 1 death. So it can be a serious issue. One thing that we can do to reduce the risk of wildlife contaminating our produce is getting out there and monitoring and understanding the patterns that are going on, and just being ready to take some actions. If we don't know what's going on, then how are we going to prevent animals from getting our produce? Also, just before harvesting produce, it's a good idea to do a quick inspection and just check for animal activity, whether it's feeding or whatnot, and looking for areas where animals may have left droppings or feces, and getting those out of there and not harvesting that produce is important. We can think about ways to deter animals to reduce their prevalence in our produce fields and gardens. Decoys are one way to do that. You can see there's a few different options here. The coyote and the owl in this example have movement incorporated with them, so the coyote's tail moves with the wind, and that owl is with the wind. It also moves, and that can help. The swan there is actually there to deter geese. Um, my my father has big issues with geese eating his soybeans in the spring, and so he's actually used the coyote, and that has worked pretty well. It's also a good idea to move these things around every once in a while, which can it prevents the animals from getting used to them being where they are. Exclusion is a way that we can deter animals from getting into our produce fields and gardens. So whether it's, for example, the fence in the upper left that you see is a two fences right next to each other that can work for deer. Or you can go nuclear and build the one on the right, which is a 8 or 10 foot fence that really works a lot better. Um, and then netting can be effective for keeping birds out of things like blueberries, which I think is in the bottom left. Obviously, these things can be expensive, so trying to do it in a way that makes sense for your operation is important. Some visual deterrents that we can use. We're thinking about things that incorporate movement and are maybe shiny or flashy. So on the left, you can see it's kind of like a piece of tape or whatever that is reflectant and will move. On the right is one of those floppy guys that like car salesmen use and whatnot. But those are really good because their movement is completely random, and so animals don't get accustomed to them being there, and those things can be pretty effective. Other things that people do are things like balloons that are out there, or people hang CDs because they're shiny and move with the wind. It can be effective as well. There's some other stuff out there. Certainly, probably some of you are familiar with cannons, air cannons that people use. Um, there are tactile methods, like this is an example of kind of like a glue that's put on a surface that keeps birds from perching. Irish Spring, lots of people swear by soap and its ability to keep things away. And then some people do trapping and relocation of animals as well. It's important to kind of follow your local laws and regulations if we're talking about trapping and whatnot with animals. All right, we've talked about the wild animals. Let's talk about domestic animals. Um, Pets can be a blessing and a curse. If we have pets that are spending time out in our garden or produce fields, they can be leaving droppings and feces around, and that can be a problem. However, they may be out there and they might be hunting and keeping our rabbit population down or keeping deer out of the field. So they can be a benefit. You just kind of have to balance those needs and the way that those pets are acting and what they're doing with their time out there. Um, Related to livestock, certainly livestock is something that we need to think about. Both the time that the cows get out and go in the garden and drop some cow pies is certainly a problem. But also thinking about things like the location of animals in respect to growing produce. We obviously don't want erosion to carry things or wind to move manure into our produce fields either. But if they do get out, it's going to happen, right? But if the pigs get out, or the chickens get out, or the cows get out, um, going out and doing an inspection to see if there was anything left out there in the field that we need to get rid of, and also again, when we're at harvest and we see that thing has been pooped on, we're not going to harvest that. Okay. All right, let's talk about manure specifically. So manure can be a really excellent resource for fruit and vegetable production. It's a nutrient source as well as just an input that really improves our soil health. But we want to be thinking about it carefully because it certainly can carry pathogens that can make people ill. So we want to think about the equipment that we're using. So for example, if we're moving manure with a tractor on a bucket, later that afternoon we probably don't want to be using that same bucket to haul a bunch of cantaloupe around. Okay. We also want to be thinking about where manure is located. So in the photo on the right, you can see that we have a pile of manure right next to, it looks like we've got some raspberries or something behind it, and then maybe some greens in front of it, which really presents an opportunity for wind to blow things around. We also have an opportunity for runoff and contamination through that. So these are really important things to think about. Again, manure can be a really nice, high quality resource for fruit and vegetable production, but we need to co-manage it and balance our food safety risks with it. Some of the things that we can do to reduce the risk in applying it to the fields is adjusting our timing. So rather doing a spring application, we might do a fall application. That just increases the amount of time between when it was applied and when those vegetables or fruits are going to get harvested, which reduces the risk of people getting ill because things die off over time. Incorporating manure is also helpful, not only because it's no longer on the surface and it can't splash up onto our produce, but also by incorporating it, some of the microorganisms in the soil are going to break it down and take care of some of those pathogens that could be in the manure. We also might think about the amount that we're applying, so applying it based on the needs of the crop, and also just thinking about what crop gets manure. So we might focus our manure applications on crops that go through one of those kill steps that we talked about before, where through cooking, any pathogens that might be in it are killed. Okay. Again, talking about storage and manure, having things covered and just in a good location that's going to reduce the risk of either water moving it, wind moving it. That's a really good thing to think about and consider. Composting can be a good way to deal with manure because through the composting process we reach really warm temperatures that can kill pathogens, and then we just have a smaller pool of them or no pool of pathogens that can infect and cause illness. So water is obviously important in the production of fruit and vegetables as well as after production. So whether we're washing or cooling or doing other things with water post-harvest. But we use it for irrigation, we can use it for fertigation, we can be using crop sprays that are mixed with water, frost protection, other methods too where it's contacting water. Some things to think about with water is the source of our water. So if we're in town and we have a public water source, that water is being tested and treated for any kind of pathogen that might be in it, and that's regulated by the government, and so there's a little bit lower risk there. Groundwater, which most of us who live out in the country would be getting water from, has some risk. There are ways that groundwater can get contaminated with bacteria and other pathogens, but it's a little bit more risky than a public water supply. Surface water is a little bit more risky, and that's cases where you might be using water from a pond to irrigate or whatever you're doing with it in terms of vegetable production or fruit production. Since it's open to the environment, there's greater risk for it becoming contaminated. It's not a bad idea if you're on a well or using surface water to test your water for bacteria periodically. The generic E. coli is a nice indicator test, both for that will tell you that you might have E. coli pathogenic E. coli in your water, but also is a good indicator test for the possibility of other pathogens being in there, because it essentially tells us that there are feces in our water and we have a chance that it's contaminated. Some ways that we can reduce the risk based on the way that we apply it include like manure, spreading or having a greater gap between when it's applied and when we harvest the fruit or vegetable. Gives those pathogens time to die off out on the surface of the ground or on our crops. Also, by applying it in a way that doesn't come into contact with the produce is a good way to do things. So when we're out there watering, not getting it on the leaves or the fruit itself, and just going to the roots is a nice way to reduce risk as well. All right, let's get into hygiene and health. There are a number of things in this area that I want to talk about. So first, like on the photo on the left, this person has obviously been spending some time moving some manure around. And you know, if this is part of your job or part of one of the things that you do on your farm or on a farm that you work at, and you later go and work with fruits and vegetables, we need to be thinking about what we're going to do in between there. So we might be changing our clothes, getting different boots on, because walking into a produce field like that, especially close to harvest, is not a good idea and opens us up to contaminating our produce. Other things, you might just switch around the order of work that you do. You know, if you have to work with vegetables and animals, work with the vegetables first, and then go do the work with the animals and the manure later. That can be a simple way of reducing risk. If we're ill, especially with foodborne illnesses, it's important to not be working with produce, because we are carrying a foodborne illness, and if we're working with food that's going to be consumed by someone else, it's just a really high risk situation. So if you have one of those foodborne illnesses, it's best to be doing something else or just getting better at home, right? And then our hands. I'll talk a little bit more about hand washing, but our hands are a really good way to get stuff dirty, right? Some other routes of contamination, I mentioned hands. We've talked about illness, being injured as well. So if you have an injury or a cut, getting that bandaged and covered. Feces can be routes of contamination. Our tools, I mentioned footwear and clothing already, but these are all ways that we can contaminate produce. All right, proper hand washing is really important. Not everybody does all all that well, so we want to be doing it for at least 20 seconds. It's important to get all parts of your hands washed. So underneath the fingernails, if you're using a brush, or just using the palm of your hand to clean things out, the tops of your hands, getting those crevices and whatnot. Some people forget to clean their thumb. You need to get your thumb cleaned. Also, like your wrist as well is a good contact area to get clean as well. Get them rinsed thoroughly. Dry them off. If you can, turn the faucet off, not with your hands, because you just turned it on with your dirty hands, and if you turn it off with your clean hands, you may be recontaminating your hands anyway. So that's something to think about as well. Hand sanitizers don't clean your hands off. They might kill some of the stuff that's on there, but it may not get it all, and it's just really a bad replacement for hand washing. So wash your hands. If you're handling produce, it's really important to do so just beforehand. If you're working somewhere else or just got done eating, or you're on a break or something, wash your hands before you go and work with produce. All right, so that's kind of it. We talked about why food safety is a part of farm safety, and the fact that we can make ourselves ill or other people ill based on the things that we're doing with our produce. And then went through those 5 areas where we can reduce those risks. So I wish you luck in this area, and thank you for listening.